Popular journalist and author Malcolm Gladwell is in the news for remarks he gave on the topic of transgender athletes.
Gladwell recently appeared on the Real Science of Sports podcast, where he recalled a panel that he moderated 3 years ago with podcast host Ross Tucker. Gladwell says he felt he was cowed at the panel, and he's ashamed he did not push back more against the idea of trans women playing female sports.
If we did a replay of that exact panel at the Sloan Conference this coming March, it runs in exactly the opposite direction. And it would be, I suspect, near unanimity in the room that trans athletes have no place in the female category. I don't think there's any question.
Now, Gladwell went on to say that he thinks the movement behind allowing trans women to compete in female sports has gotten too extreme.
What the trans movement is not asking for, they're not asking for, a place at the table. They're not asking for to be treated with respect and dignity. What they're asking is for no one to question the considerable physiological advantage they bring to the sport, and no one to question if they're going to win these races by 5 seconds. Suck it up. That's what they were asking.
Now, some people, such as Tim Miller from MSNBC, didn't take kindly to Gladwell's stance. Miller, writing on X, quote, "Rich people stop blaming their clinical desire to be loved on others' challenge. These guys weren't cowed into anything. They said then in vogue thing, then they are saying the in vogue thing now."
Meanwhile, conservative commentator Matt Walsh says that while he agrees with Gladwell on the issue, he doesn't trust him because of this. Quote, "I'm glad that all of these people are finally coming over to the same side of the issue, but this is not a forgive and forget situation. If you were cowed into denying basic biological reality, you've permanently lost your credibility, and we can never trust you again." This went very viral on social media yesterday. Lindsey, a lot of people reacting to this. To the interesting scenario that Gladwell lays out. So according to him, he thought all along it was a little suspect to let trans women compete against biological women in sports, but he felt like he couldn't say that because the elite consensus was so strongly in favor of that position, even though the popular opinion, this is always like an 80-20 issue, right? Even among like Democrats, which goes to show you the power of ideological groupthink among very progressive cultural commentators that were that far to the left, and you'd be afraid to offend them when the people are so much the other way. I think Tim Miller is very, very wrong there in his analysis that, right, he just was saying the popular, why did he feel pressure? The pressure was real. Journalists who flashed with that perspective were early on were ostracized. Yes, right. That now it's caught up to public opinion and it's okay to dissent from what a very small number of people think, at least in the US. In the UK, you can be arrested for it, as I pointed out in my radar. But it is interesting that we've come a long way since, the period 5 years ago or so, the height of what I consider the height of wokeness. What do you think?
Well, I think what he said was that the conference that he feel like he got cowed into saying something was 3 years ago. So that takes us to 2022. Yeah. That time was totally different than now. And so the actual feeling of speaking up about something, and this is even a nuanced conversation that we can have right now in this moment, the active feeling of speaking up against anything that you think Israel or Benjamin Netanyahu is doing is the same kind of thing of like people were afraid to speak up at some point because they feel like they'll be labeled as anti-Semitic, but now some people are not scared to say, no, Benjamin Netanyahu could be in the wrong in these ways, and here's what we would do differently. That pendulum has swung to center so people can actually have a thought, just like he's actually allowed to have a thought about if he feels that we should look more at biology when it comes down to transgender people. I think that, he was being a journalist that was trying to be objective in a dishonest way is how he described it, because he felt like the consensus was, and maybe from really loud voices that were minimal at the time, however you want to say, but they were very loud, because I understand that we started to have those conversations and I was on air at that time, that you just want to walk the line. So you can't even question or ask a question without looking like there should be a fear of backlash or without feeling like you're going to get attacked by the loudest people in many rooms. So in that regard, I'll agree with you that sometimes the circulation on a lot of popular channels can be similar. And then you're like, especially around that topic, it was like, oh, you can't even ask a question. And what changed things for me is that I was able to sit down in the last few years on a personal time. I was at the hair salon with the mother of a transgender person. And I think that conversation really allowed me to have an attachment and understanding from her perspective of what that feels like. So a lot of times we're talking about it and nobody has a direct contact or link to any of this group of people or this experience. And so people are just saying what they would do, you don't know unless you have a kid that's transgender. You don't know unless you're in the situation. And so I think we're speaking from a place that's like not real. And I think it's important when you try to navigate new situations or how to talk about them, that you not get berated for making a mistake or for trying to understand a social issue that is rapidly changing. Like, it's hard to keep up with a lot of things. Like, if I got a pronoun wrong, I would be scared back in the day. And now people just talk to me like, no, refer to me as this. And this is just something that you have to give grace and let people learn. And I think that was taken away largely in the height of 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And a lot of the changes were made with good intention, trying to, stop people from being abused in certain ways, stop certain groups from being mistreated. But I think the pendulum swung so far that people were scared to say anything. And that's too far all the time.
And I assume, I guess I don't know, I haven't polled them myself, but that most trans people, most trans women also think that having, in certain sports categories, having trans women compete against biological women, or cis women to use that term, is not fair or called for. It depends on the sport, it depends on the age level, but they are seeking, they're seeking, equal accommodation and dignity, not and legal rights, not to win the every swim meet on earth. So that the consensus was so that elites so wanted to make it that you couldn't dissent with that, when even that's not even what trans people are fighting for, I don't think. Not that I speak for them or know exactly what it is that they want, but I don't the ones I've talked to don't sound like, our top issue is making sure one of us takes the gold medal at the at the Olympics.
Well, on the other side of that, I think Republicans do a really good job at hyper activating issues that are really fringe, right? So there's not a pandemic of trans athletes taking the gold home and so that's what I'm saying. No, it's not. No, stop. I don't think that. So let me just say,
it only takes one.
Okay, fine, one, but how many schools are across the country? How many collegiate sports are happening across the country? So, yes, we should look at this and try to figure out how to handle it they are.
It's so overwhelming that one has a high likelihood.
But the incident doesn't have to match the outrage. That's what I'm saying. It's not that outrageous. If it's one in the entire country for the year, if it's 5 for the country, and knowing how many schools are in the country, the outrage from the Republican side usually doesn't match what's actually happening. And so that's why when you say
outrage never matches exactly
right,
what's
but when you say that
outrage to reality,
when you say that the people on the left were too dramatically trying to say let trans people do whatever and making people feel scared to talk, people on the right were actively acting like this was a disaster that was about to take the world down and we need to get ahead of it right now. And I think both are dramatic. We need to come together and actually maybe sit down and see what trans people are looking for, because like you said, I can't speak for the community and don't know, but what I understand is that
of swim meets and track meets where
fine, and what I understand is that this is a legitimate community that feels that they are isolated in many ways and probably wants to start with being heard and not people speaking for them on either a liberal or a Republican network, right? They probably just would like to speak for themselves. So how about just having more people at the table to say what they want? Because I actually have never, even that woman was not talking about sports with me, with her kid, right? It had nothing to do with sports. Her kid was just living her normal life, doing her regular job and enjoying her days. It had nothing to do with playing a sport. And so that conversation is kind of rare, at least, and it's rare that I even had a conversation with a trans person very often. So what I'm saying is maybe more people need to be in the room that are actually of that community so we can understand what's really wanted and what they're requesting.
Next up, Ben Shapiro and Scott Jennings clash with Anna Kasparian on CNN over Social Security and funding for foreign wars. We'll be right back.